All right, we're picking back up in 2 Samuel chapter 1. So the book divides basically because the first book is mainly focused on the reign of Saul, or Saul's reign as king. The second book is more so focused on David's reign as king. The basic reason why they're separated in our Bibles, obviously they were written as one book initially. So we noticed the last chapter, or we noticed last week, that this chapter is really focused on how two different individuals in particular respond to the death of Saul. And last week we talked about the response of the messenger that comes from Saul's camp. And we know that David had no part in that. David was not with the Philistines when that happened, even though he did serve some time in their military. We read the response of a messenger that comes from Saul's camp. And how would you describe the state of that messenger? Just recalling what we read last week. How would you describe the state of that messenger?
He appeared, he had the signs of mourning, clothes torn, earth upon his head. He appeared, or gave the appearance of mourning, but also glad to bring David news, what he thought would be news of Saul's death.
Yeah, that's the point. You have the picture here of the messenger that comes. He's got his clothes torn. He's got sackcloth on. He's got earth on his head. He shows all the signs of basically being in mourning. But as we noted last week in 2 Samuel 4 verse 10, David said that he actually came to bring good news. And as we worked our way down through verse 11 or down through verse 10 last week, we sort of talked about when the Amalekite is explaining what happens here. He changes the story a little bit from what happened. We know that Saul took his own life according to 1 Samuel 31, according to 1 Chronicles 10. This was done because of punishment coming to Saul. The Amalekite told David that who killed Saul? He did. The Amalekite took credit for it. And he brings him the crown. He brings him the king's armlet or the king's bracelet that he'd have on his arm. And in the mind of the messenger, he's coming to David announcing that he's the one that took David's enemy's life. He's the one that's responsible for Saul's death. So in his mind, what he's thinking is about to happen here is that David's going to reward him for killing Saul, the man that's persecuted him, the man that's pursued him throughout the last third of the book of 1 Samuel. But now we pick up with David's response, and this is, again, the main focus, the comparison between the messenger's response versus David's response to Saul's death. Verse 11, we begin to read what David's response is. And we're going to try to do our best to get down probably through verse 18 this morning. So verse 11, then David took hold on his clothes and rent or tore them, and likewise all the men that were with him. If you were there, at least in my mind, I could almost picture watching this play out, that when David goes and he tears his clothes, that the servant's jaw drops when he sees this. You can almost picture the messenger here being confused, having a very confused look on his face, because he thinks David's going to rejoice that Saul has died. Right? And that goes back to 2 Samuel 4 verse 10. The messenger thought he was bringing good tidings to David. He thought David might be somewhat sorrowful, but in some ways, noting that Saul has died, David might be somewhat happy about it. So you could almost expect here, if you're watching this, that figuratively, that the jaw of the messenger drops because of what David does here. He's not happy at all. Instead, he likewise took hold of his own clothes and tore them, and not just him, but all the men that were with him. Now, the tearing of clothes is obviously an expression of sorrow, right? The messenger back in verse 2 of 2 Samuel 1 did the same thing. But we're going to note here that David's response is a lot more genuine than this messenger. He goes and he tears his clothes, again, an expression of sorrow. Now, we sort of show our grief in a number of different ways. I think when it comes to clothing today, generally, what color do we wear if we're in mourning or in grief? Black, right? That's sort of how within our tradition, if you go to a funeral, generally, especially the family, a lot of them are wearing black because we associate black with grief. Wearing a dark suit, a black suit with grief, a black dress with grief. But they had a different way of expressing sorrow through their clothing, and that was to tear their clothes. Now you note here that David does not first go and put on old clothes, or clothes that are not good, or clothes that are worn out, and then tear through those clothes. You notice that David actually tears through the clothes. He took hold of his own clothes that immediate moment, takes hold of it and tears those clothes. Now you think about David, right? David's not a king yet, but you think about the fact that he is the leader of these men. And so perhaps you think, David had a pretty good quality set of clothes on. This is an act that is not just for mourning, but there's also a lot of, if you have an expensive pair of clothes on, this is financially, this is a pretty significant statement. We talked about in Isaiah 37 a few weeks ago about King Hezekiah when he heard the news about Sennacherib surrounding Judah, that he tore his own clothes. He tore the king's garments. And those are very expensive garments. Those are not just average clothes that King Hezekiah owned. Those were expensive, extremely valuable garments. But he just went and tore right through it. Didn't matter the financial cost of it because of how great his mourning was. Same thing with David here. Right? David doesn't go and put on old clothes and then tears through them as though, he was going to get rid of them anyway. He tears through his good clothes, or at least the clothes that he had on there. Notice his men do that as well. They've been on the run. They've been basically kicked out of their own country. They don't have a nice lifestyle living in luxury per se, but notice that they also tear their own clothes. You think to yourself, how many pairs of good clothes would they have had? And then in this moment, to just be willing to tear through that to express their sorrow shows what Saul, Jonathan, and those that have died, what they meant to David and his men. Think about for a moment, you hear about, you think about, you put this account in our own context. Think if David had on a $200 suit, and he heard about this news, and you just see him tear through that $200 suit. Tear it up. Can't even wear it anymore. You think about a woman, for instance, that hears this, and she's got on let's just say something expensive like $100, $150 dress. She just tears through that or rips it up where it's not usable anymore. That's a significant amount of money that you have lost. But what it goes to show is their genuine grief about it. Genuine grief about the news of Saul, Jonathan, and these Israelites' death. It meant a lot to them. And perhaps that helps us get in our mind, the idea, we think about tearing through clothes, but these are nice clothes. These are expensive clothes. That's how much this bothered them. Notice also, again, verse 12. And they mourned and wept and fasted until even. For Saul and for Jonathan his son, for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they were fallen by the sword. Mourned and wept are kind of similar in a way, but they also have a little bit of a different meaning. The word mourned is used as the same word as lament in 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 1. And in that situation, the people of Israel had gathered together to lament the death of Samuel. A lot of times this word was used, it was connected to the idea to beat one's chest or to pull one's hair out in a state of grief. This word generally carries the idea of the grief associated with death. The word wept or weep carries the idea of crying. And so when you think about the idea of wept or weeping, you think about the actual shedding of tears and crying. When you think about the word mourned, it's sort of the state of a person that doesn't want to talk about what's happened, or a person that's reflecting over a death. A person that maybe is not necessarily crying, but you can tell that their disposition is sorrowful, that something's bothering them. And that's what these two words mean. They're not just crying. This is not just an initial show of emotion. As the text says, they do this until the evening, or this morning. This grief continues on throughout the day. And it goes to show that their reaction is genuine. They're genuinely hurting for the death of Saul and Jonathan and the people of Israel. You note, too, that they also fast. I believe in the Old Testament there was only one command time in the year where they were to fast. But a lot of times this was done out of grief. Whenever you don't eat, whenever you're sad, generally you don't have a desire to eat. And that reinforces the idea that David and his men are genuinely sorrowful for what has happened. And that's in comparison, as we'll mention in a moment, to the messenger that's reported this news. Now note who they're sorry for, right? They are sorry for Saul. You know, the text doesn't say that they're sorry for Jonathan and the people of Israel, but the author is very clear. They're also sorrowful for what has happened to Saul. Again, the messenger thought that there was some good connected to this. Saul's dead. David's about to be king. David and his men, they're no longer on the run. They can come back to Judah, and everything's going to work out perfectly because David's enemy is finally gone. But they're not. They're sorrowful, even for Saul's death. David and his men had the proper attitude. You know, David's about to get basically a promotion. There's going to be a series of conflicts with the house of Saul, but David's basically about to get a promotion, to be the king of Israel. You know, there's some people that, again, think that their fortune should outweigh the suffering of others. Doesn't matter how I got promoted, doesn't matter how I moved up or who I had to step on, or what kind of harm I did to others in my way moving up. There's some people that have that attitude. They just don't care as long as they become successful in life or they move on up in life. But David and his men had the proper attitude. David's fortune in this instance did not outweigh the suffering of the people of Israel. I think a good opposite occasion of this is again Peninnah and Hannah, right back in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Because in that occasion, Peninnah kept bragging, kept rubbing it in Hannah's face that she could have a child, but Hannah could not. Because Peninnah didn't have the proper attitude. She didn't care about the suffering of Hannah as long as it benefited her. But David is a good example to us. We don't need to rejoice in the downfall of others. That's not something that we should delight in. David didn't as well. You think about it in a spiritual sense, there are people that give us problems spiritually, right? And the natural, easy thing for us to do is whenever they fail in life, it's naturally easy to get happy about it. Sometimes we may think to ourselves, you know, those people that bother us spiritually, well, we know where their eternal resting place is. Because it isn't going to be with us. It's not going to be in heaven, but it's going to be in hell. And we have to be very careful that we don't take delight in that. Because our goal in life is what God told, or is what Paul told Timothy was God's goal, was that all men should be saved. Doesn't matter what they've done to us, doesn't matter how they've harmed us spiritually. We don't need to rejoice in their downfall on this earth, nor do we need to rejoice in the fact of where they would end up eternally if they did not repent. David's example is very clear. Do not rejoice in the harm or in the suffering of others. Now note again that the contrast is very apparent. The response is obvious. The messenger, when he arrived, he had all the physical signs of being sorrowful. He had his clothes torn. He had earth upon his head. He's a dirty individual because he wants to make himself physically uncomfortable. But mentally or in his mind, he's not. He's thinking he's about to get a promotion within David's kingdom. And his entire sorrow was only for show. His heart and his appearance don't line up. But the author is telling us that David and his men, their appearance and their heart is in line. They have the physical signs of mourning, but their mourning, as he says in verse 12, not just for Jonathan and the people of the Lord, but also for Saul. Because Saul's death has meant a very tragic result for Israel, as we saw in chapter 31, the death and the loss of land for a lot of Israelites. So now, David begins to handle the Amalekite, verses 13 through 16. And David said unto the young men that told him, Whence art thou, or where are you from? And he answered, I am the son of a stranger, an Amalekite. Now we have a little bit of new information here on the identity of this messenger, right? He said, verse 1, verse 8, that he was an Amalekite, but it's a little bit more clear here. He is, what he says here, I am the son of a stranger, an Amalekite. And that is a little bit different description than verses 1 and 8 that we need to talk about for a moment. What does the word stranger mean to us? What do we think about when we think about someone who's a stranger? We don't know him. He's somebody who's unfamiliar. Well, in this context, the idea of stranger carries the idea of rejecting one's citizenship. Rejecting one's citizenship. I want you to turn in your Bibles for a moment to Hebrews chapter 11. Because the writer of Hebrews sort of does a really good job, or really that the text in Hebrews 11, verses 13 through 16, it does a good job of helping explain the meaning of stranger with that idea of rejecting one's citizenship. Right, so in Hebrews 11, verse 13, we're talking about basically Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the text says, These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them. And note what the writer says, and confessed that they were what? Strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. And truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. But now they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city. So, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you have the picture here. Not only were they sojourning for the land of Israel, but they were also sojourning for what we could call spiritual Israel. The citizenship that is in heaven that Peter talks about in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11, when he addressed his readers that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. So the idea of stranger means to reject one's citizenship. And so what he's saying here in verse 13, that I am the son of a stranger, an Amalekite, he's saying that his father had rejected citizenship with the Amalekites. And that he basically had proselytized to Judaism. He had converted to Judaism. This is a little bit different scenario than the other Amalekites that David has fought before. This is an Amalekite who is not in rebellion against God per se, in the sense that he's worshiping foreign gods, but he's a man who became an Israelite. He proselytized to Judaism. Hence, why he was serving in Saul's camp, or why he was present there when Saul died. And this is a good point to bring out. You know, there's some people that look at the Old Testament and say that God didn't have mercy, or that God was not a merciful God, or that God didn't care about the people that the Israelites eliminated. Well, here's an example of an individual that actually, from what the text indicates to us, lived in Israel, had the opportunity to obey God. Wasn't wiped out like those Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15 or 1 Samuel I think 29 or 30 when David attacks the Amalekites there. All right, this is an Amalekite that had the opportunity to convert to Judaism. And that's very important because now we know, why does David punish the Amalekite? He doesn't punish the Amalekite because he's an Amalekite. We need to be clear about that. He doesn't punish the Amalekite because of what Moses said in Exodus 17, or because of what God told Moses in Exodus 17 or Deuteronomy 25. The reason for his execution is not because he's an Amalekite, but verse 14, David said unto him, How wast thou not afraid to stretch forth thine hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? That's the reason why he's going to be punished. Not because you're an Amalekite, but because you stretched forth your hand against the Lord's anointed. In the Old Testament, the strangers, or those that proselytized to Judaism, they were under the same law as those who were born in Israel. Look for a moment, Leviticus chapter 20, verse 2. Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 2. Again, thou shalt say to the children of Israel, whosoever he be of the children of Israel, or of the strangers that sojourn in Israel, that giveth any of his seed unto Molech, he shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. The importance there is those that be of the children of Israel and those that are strangers that sojourn in Israel. They're under the same law. Flip over a couple of 4 chapters to the right to chapter 24. Chapter 24, verse 16. Here's another violation of the law. But note who it applies to. Leviticus 24, verse 16. He that blasphemeth the name of the Lord, he shall surely be put to death, and all the congregation shall certainly stone him, as well the stranger, as he that is born in the land. Right? So the stranger and he that is born in the land, talking about a natural-born Israelite compared to one who is proselytized or had moved to Israel. They are both under the same law. 24, now verse 22. Ye shall have one manner or one standard of law, as well for the stranger as for one of your own country, for I am the Lord your God. Saying the same thing there, right? One standard of law for those that are born in Israel and those that proselytize, that become Israelites because they decide to worship the God of Israel. And so the point being in verse 14, David's not killing him because he's an Amalekite. He's killing this Amalekite because he should have known that no Israelite can put his hand against the Lord's anointed to take his life. David, on multiple occasions, had that opportunity to stretch forth his hand against the Lord's anointed. But what did he say in chapter 24 and chapter 26 when he had that opportunity? It's not my right. It's not my place. It's not my responsibility to remove the man that God has appointed. He had to convince his men of that. You think back to 1 Samuel chapter 31, verse 4, when Saul is knowing that he's about to be killed by the Philistines. But you note in 1 Samuel 31, verse 4, Saul tells the armor bearer, draw thy sword, thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me. But know what's said. Verse 4, his armor bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. The armor bearer didn't have the right to take the life of the Lord's anointed. David understood that as well. And as a result, this is the reason why this man is punished. Verse 15, David called one of the young men and said, go near and fall upon him. And he smote him that he died. And David said unto him, thy blood be upon thine head, for thy head or for thy mouth have testified against thee, saying, I have slain the Lord's anointed. Now you think here in verse 15, to me there's a great comparison between what David does here about killing the man that took the life of the Lord's anointed. And I think back to this, I think of this example, I think back to 1 Samuel 20 and 21, where Saul told Doeg the Edomite to take the lives of the priests of Israel. And they weren't anointed as kings, but they were appointed to be the head of Israel's religion because they were of the tribe of Levi. I think about what Saul did wrong there, but I think about what David has done right here. He doesn't kill the Lord's anointed, but he does kill the man responsible, at least in his mind, for killing the Lord's anointed. David perhaps doesn't actually know what happened in 1 Samuel 31, but he does go ahead and take the life of the Amalekite. Notice verse 16. David said unto him, thy blood be upon thy head, and thy mouth have testified against thee, saying, I have slain the Lord's anointed. Thy blood be upon thine head. That's just another way of saying that, messenger or Amalekite, you were responsible for your own death. You brought death upon yourself for what you have said. I'm not guilty of committing murder here because your blood is upon your head. And you might tie in here 1 Samuel 25, verse 26, right, where Abigail warned David, David, if you go and you kill Nabal, you are avenging yourself with your own hand. You will shed blood with your own hand. And David doesn't, and that prevents David from murdering in that situation. But in this case, David has a right to put this man to death because he has put his hand, or at least he claims he's put his hand against the Lord's anointed. So at the end, you see this response. The messenger, he's got all the outward appearances of being sorrowful for what's happened, but his heart was secretly rejoicing in this. David, on the other hand, he was outwardly mourning, had the signs of mourning, but he inwardly was also sorrowful as well, not just for Jonathan, but also for Saul and the rest of the people of Israel. And now this next section, this last section of chapter 1, basically David writes a song that expresses that grief. But again, this first section of 2 Samuel 1, a good example of how we respond to the suffering of others. We don't rejoice in it. With that being said, are there any comments that you'd like to add on to what we've talked about down through verse 16?
You get in trouble.
Yeah. If you lie, that generally leads to trouble. That's certainly true.
It's a real mark of character to do as David did here. Our world is so filled with hate, and so often we take our cues from the world, and that's just not the way it ought to be. A mark of character, and of course for us Christianity, to be able to, anybody can weep when a friend dies. Pharisees would do that, but to weep and mourn when your worst enemy, dies, that's a different matter. That's I think a real mark of Christian character to be able to mourn at the loss of an avowed enemy.
Mm-hmm. That's a good thing. That's a good mindset that I think, in a spiritual sense, I think that's a good mindset that congregations need to have, because we don't always get along with one another, but we never need to get to the point where we rejoice and sing at a fellow Christian suffering in life. If we get to that point, we've got to do some serious soul searching. We've got to check our hearts, because our heart's not in the right place. David, Saul tried to kill David, but David understood that Saul, like him, was a child of God, or was of the children of Israel. And certainly David didn't get along with Saul, and it wasn't David's fault, but David did not rejoice in seeing his spiritual brother, at least by blood, through the children of Israel. He did not rejoice in seeing him die. All right, so this next section is basically a lamentation a lamentation about what's happened. Right? We know David's certainly a great musician. He wrote many of the Psalms. This specific psalm is written in response to the death, in response to what has happened here. Now, we'll note as we go through, and we're not going to really get into this morning, we'll talk about a little bit of an introduction to it. There's a phrase that is used on 3 occasions in this song that sort of gives how we're going to title this. And it might be, if you're one to mark in your Bibles, this is a phrase that you want to mark. And the phrase is, at least in the King James, it's "How are the mighty fallen?" Verse 19, "The beauty of Israel is slain upon thy high places. How are the mighty fallen?" Now down in verse 25, he says again, "How are the mighty fallen in the midst of battle?" And then the very last verse of the song, David says, "How are the mighty fallen?" Now generally whenever we say that word, "How are the mighty fallen?" we do that sometimes out of joy of watching somebody fall. But I think about like in the context of sports, like a team that builds a dynasty and they wind up their great players retire, their coach leaves or something like that. Somebody will, and the team goes from being one of the best to one of the worst. A lot of people will comment and say, how the mighty have fallen. Sometimes we use that in a positive sense, but David doesn't do that at all. How are the mighty fallen? This is a sad song that commemorates Saul, Jonathan, and the men of Israel that have died. Let's go ahead and read verses 17 and 18. Again, David lamented in this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. So we know that this is a song of grief. Verse 18, also he bade them teach the children of Judah the use of the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. All right, so about verse 18, there are some that think this phrase, the use of the bow, that it might have actually been the title to this song. Other commentators think that this phrase, the use of the bow, refers to the fact that this song was often used in military training. And perhaps we'll talk more specifically about that next week. But either the case, this phrase, the use of the bow, actually ties back to Jonathan and Saul pretty well. Where have we read about a bow in 1 Samuel chapter 1 connected to Jonathan? Yeah, right. Remember when David fled from Saul, and Jonathan shot those 3 arrows out, and that allowed David, that told David that Saul was seeking his life and that he needed to get out, and in a way that helped alert David to flee to safety, basically. So there's a lot of significance here about the idea of the bow for David when you think about how close of a friend Jonathan was, and we'll see that at the end of this song next week. But another thing to keep in mind is that the men of Benjamin were known for their ability to their ability to use a bow and arrow. In fact, in the book of Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, there are 3 occasions where the men of Benjamin are specifically tied to their expertise with using the bow. And what tribe were Jonathan and Saul a part of? They were a part of the tribe of Benjamin. And so this song is actually this is basically David giving a song, dedicating this song as though he's dedicating this song to 2 heroes of Israel in particular. This is the type of song that a hero would be given about his legacy. And this, we'll note next week, this reveals in large part David's mindset, not just what happens in verses 11 through 16, but David basically gives not just Jonathan and the men of Israel, but he also gives Saul this song that would often be that in style would often be dedicated to a military hero. And we'll talk more about that next week because I think that aspect is very interesting. But we'll stop here. Are there any other thoughts or comments that you'd like to add on before we end this Bible class? If not, we will pick up in verse. We'll pick up in verse 18 next week. But thank you for your time and thank you for your attention.